The moment Inez Kendrick raised her fist to knock on Chester Atkins's door, she nearly turned and walked back down the porch steps and all the way home, because the pie in her hands suddenly felt like the most insufficient offering in the world for what her husband had done. She stood there in the dry August heat of 1882, the sun pressing down on the flat Oklahoma Territory land with the kind of relentless conviction that made everything, the red dirt, the scrubby mesquite, the weathered boards of Chester Atkins's modest ranch house, look somehow both stark and eternal. The pie was a peach, because she had heard from Mabel Dunmore at the general store that Chester Atkins had a soft spot for peaches, and it was the only piece of intelligence she had been able to gather about the man in the 3 weeks since she had decided she needed to come here and face him. 3 weeks of gathering courage, and here she stood, boots dusty from the walk down the rutted road, a pie growing warm in her hands, and the distinct sensation that she had made a terrible mistake. But she knocked. The sound was firmer than she felt. There was silence inside, the kind of silence that a person who lives alone builds up over years, thick and undisturbed. Then boots on floorboards, slow and deliberate, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who was not startled by anything anymore. The door swung open and Chester Atkins stood there, and Inez had to work hard to keep her face composed because she had not expected him to look the way he did. She had expected someone older, angrier looking. She had built up in her mind a picture of a man embittered and weathered by what her husband had done to him, a man with hard eyes and a set jaw and no interest whatsoever in anything she might have to say. What she found was a man of perhaps 36 years, tall and lean with the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of working land and cattle. He had brown hair that needed cutting, a jaw that was shadowed with 2 days of beard, and eyes the color of the sky just after rain, a particular shade of gray-blue that she found entirely unexpected. He was not wearing his hat, which made him seem somehow more human, more approachable. He looked at her without particular expression, and then his gaze dropped to the pie. Inez straightened her spine. "Mr. Atkins," she said, "my name is Inez Kendrick. My late husband was Douglas Kendrick." "I believe you knew him." Something shifted in those gray-blue eyes, something complicated that she could not fully read. "I knew of him," Chester said. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that did not give away much. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Kendrick?" Inez drew a breath. She had rehearsed this. She had stood in her kitchen and rehearsed it out loud at least a dozen times, speaking to the wall and to the window and once to her horse, who had been considerably more patient than she had expected. She had the words ready. "I came to apologize," she said, "for what Douglas did to you, with the water rights. I know he filed false papers with the land office and cut you off from the creek, and I know that cost you 1/3 of your herd 2 summers ago when the drought came. I know what that loss meant. I have not had the means to make it right in any material way, but I wanted you to know that I knew what he did, and I am sorry for it, and I thought," she looked down at the pie and then back up at him, "I thought the least I could do was come here in person and say so." Chester Atkins was quiet for a long moment. The heat hummed around them. Somewhere in his pasture, a horse moved and blew out a heavy breath. He looked at her with those particular eyes, and then he said something she had not expected at all. "Mrs. Kendrick," he said, "that apology is not yours to make." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. You didn't file the papers," he said. "You didn't cut the water off. Your husband did. I've got no grievance with you. But did you know what he was doing when he did it?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she admitted. "I found out after. I found the papers in his desk after he died." "Then there's nothing for you to apologize for," Chester said, and his tone was not unkind, only certain. He was a man who said what he meant, that much was plain. He leaned slightly against the door frame, and then his eyes went back to the pie, and something in his expression changed in a way that was so subtle she might have imagined it. "That a peach pie?" Inez looked down at it. "It is." "I'll take the pie," he said. She almost laughed. It came out of her as something between surprise and genuine amusement, a small sound she had not intended at all, and she pressed her lips together to contain it, but not quickly enough, and she saw the corner of Chester Atkins's mouth move in what might have been, under other circumstances, the beginning of a smile. "Would you like to come in and have a slice?" he said. "It's too hot to eat standing on a porch." That was how it began. She sat at the kitchen table of Chester Atkins's ranch house with a slice of her own pie on a plate in front of her, and he sat across the table with a coffee cup he had poured without asking if she wanted one, and then went back and poured her one too, and set it in front of her without ceremony. The kitchen was clean in the way a bachelor's kitchen is: clean, functional, spare. Nothing decorative except for a single blue ceramic mug hanging on a nail by the window that looked like it had been there long enough to belong to someone else's life. The walls were bare wood. There was a rifle above the fireplace in the main room she could see through the doorway, and a pair of worn leather gloves on the kitchen counter, and a stack of papers near the door that looked like land records or ledgers. It was the house of a man who kept his practical life in order and left no room for ornamentation. "How long has your husband been gone?" Chester asked, and the question was blunt but not unkind. 8 months, Inez said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He died in January, a fever." Chester nodded once. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and she believed he meant it, even though Inez Kendrick had wronged him badly. That surprised her. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she had never been good at accepting condolences without adding something honest to them, she said, "It was complicated, in the grief of it. Douglas was not always an easy man." Chester said nothing to that. He ate his pie with careful attention to it, and she appreciated that he did not fill the silence with noise. "This is very good pie," he said finally. "My mother's recipe," Inez said. "She grew up in Georgia before the war. She always said a good peach pie was worth more than a month of Sundays." Chester looked at her with those steady eyes. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Inez said. "She passed 3 years ago." Another small silence settled between them, easy enough, and Inez noticed that the light through the kitchen window fell at a particular angle in the afternoon, filling the room with something warm, and that Chester Atkins's hands around his coffee cup were the hands of a working man, calloused and deliberate. She did not stay long that first time. She was conscious of propriety, conscious of what the people of Harlan's Crossing might say about a widow visiting a single man's ranch, and conscious too of the fact that she had not come to impose. She had come to say what she came to say, and she had said it, and the pie had been accepted, and now she needed to collect herself and go back to her own house and her own life and figure out what came next. When she stood to leave, Chester walked her to the door. He held it open for her, and she stepped back out into the heavy heat of the afternoon, and he stood in the doorway, and she turned back to face him from the porch steps. "I'm sorry again," she said. "I know the apology wasn't mine to give, but I needed to give it anyway." "I know," Chester said. He looked at her with a directness that was not aggressive, only honest. "I appreciate that you came." She walked down the road back toward her farm, the empty pie tin swinging in one hand, and she did not look back, though she wanted to. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat at the junction of 2 wagon roads in the Oklahoma Territory, population 400 and growing. It had a general store run by the Dunmore family, a blacksmith named Orville Hayes, who was also the unofficial doctor for anything that did not require actual surgery, a small schoolhouse, a church that doubled as a courthouse when needed, a saloon called the Red Oak that stayed technically within the law's ambiguous tolerance, and a post office that received the mail rider every Tuesday and Friday. It was the kind of town that existed because the land demanded it. People needed supplies, needed community, needed somewhere to register their claims and buy their nails and gossip about their neighbors. Inez Kendrick had lived in Harlan's Crossing for 6 years, having come west from Missouri with Douglas in 1876 when they were newly married and the territory was opening up. She had been 24 then, with high hopes and a wagon full of household goods, and a naivete about Douglas's character that had worn away slowly and steadily over the following years. Douglas had not been a cruel man, not in the physical sense, but he had been a selfish one, and he had been a man who believed that what he needed was always more important than what anyone else needed, and that rules were suggestions directed at other people. The water rights situation with Chester Atkins was not the first time Douglas had cut corners at another man's expense. It was, however, the worst of it, because the drought had been severe, and the loss of the herd had been devastating for a man trying to build a cattle operation from scratch. Inez had found out the truth of it the way she found out many things about Douglas, in the quiet aftermath of his death, going through his papers and his desk, finding the forged documents and the records of the bribes paid to the territorial land registrar. She had felt sick reading it, the particular sick feeling of loving a person and discovering a depth of wrongness in them that you had not wanted to see. She had sat with that knowledge for 2 months before deciding what to do with it. She could not undo the forged papers without creating legal problems. She did not have the money or the knowledge to navigate. She could not restore Chester Atkins's cattle. She could bake a pie and go knock on a man's door, and that was the sum of what she had been able to do, and the inadequacy of it had nearly stopped her from doing it at all. But she had gone, and now, walking home in the afternoon sun with the empty tin, she felt something she had not expected to feel lighter. Not resolved exactly, but lighter, as if the weight of carrying that particular knowledge alone had been reduced somehow by the act of sharing it, even in this small and insufficient way. She did not think she would see Chester Atkins again with any frequency. He ran his cattle operation north of town, she worked her farm south of it, and their paths had not crossed in the 6 years she had been in Harlan's Crossing, a fact which now struck her as slightly strange given how small the place was. But they occupied different circles. She was known in the church circle, the women's sewing group, the domestic economy of the town. Chester Atkins, she had gathered, was known at the feed store and the Red Oak and the stretch of road that went north toward the territories. They were adjacent to the same world but not, until today, part of each other's. She thought she would see him from a distance at the general store occasionally. She thought the matter was settled. She thought wrong. It was the following Tuesday that she saw him again. She was at Dunmore's general store picking up flour and sugar and the bolt of blue cotton she had been waiting 3 weeks for, and she was standing at the counter waiting for Mabel Dunmore to tally her account when the door opened and Chester Atkins came in, and their eyes met across the store immediately, as if there had been some arrangement she had not been informed of. He nodded to her. She nodded back. "Mr. Atkins," she said. "Mrs. Kendrick," he said. He went to the hardware section of the store and began looking at hinges with the focused attention of a man who had a specific problem to solve. She collected her goods and paid her account and was about to leave when he appeared at the counter beside her with a box of hinges and a coil of wire. "Your fence along the east road," he said, out of nowhere, and she turned to look at him. "I beg your pardon. Your fence along the east road," he said again. "About a 1/4 mile back toward your property. 3 of the posts are leaning bad. Another hard wind and you'll have cattle in your crops." She stared at him. "How do you know about my fence?" "I ride the east road every week to get to the feed lot," he said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "I noticed." Inez was not sure what to say to that. She was a woman alone on a 40-acre farm, and she had been managing her own fence repair since January, and the east fence was indeed a problem she had noted and set aside because there was always something more pressing. It was one of 30 problems on the property that she rotated through with limited energy and resources. "I'm aware of the fence," she said, somewhat stiffly. "I could fix it," he said. He was looking at Mabel Dunmore and not at Inez, as if he were discussing something of mild and theoretical interest. "I've got the tools. I'll be coming by that way Saturday." "Mr. Atkins, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. He looked at her then. "Do you want it fixed or not?" She held his gaze for a moment. There was no pity in his expression. There was no condescension. He was asking a practical question about a practical problem and offering a practical solution, and the only thing in his eyes was a straightforward interest in her answer. "That's very kind," she said. "Saturday, then," he said, and turned back to Mabel to pay for his hinges. Inez walked out into the August heat with her flour and her sugar and her blue cotton, and the strange, stirring feeling that something had shifted in a direction she had not anticipated. Saturday came, and Chester Atkins came with it. He arrived at her property at 8 in the morning, before the worst of the heat, driving a small wagon with fence posts and tools, and she met him at the gate because she had heard his wagon on the road, and she was not going to pretend she had not been watching for him. "You didn't have to bring posts," she said, looking at the wagon. "Yours are rotted at the base," he said, climbing down. "Patching them won't hold." "How do you know they're rotted at the base?" "Because the leaning ones always are, and your soil holds moisture low," he said. "What kind of crops are you running?" It was, she realized, a genuine question, the beginning of a conversation about the land, and she found herself answering it as they walked out to the east fence, telling him about the corn and the kitchen garden and the small apple orchard Douglas had planted in the first year that had taken 4 years to produce anything and now gave her the best apples in the county. "Apples," he said, with a note in his voice that was very close to admiration. "In this climate." "It's the microclimate on the south slope," she said. "Douglas planted them facing southeast, and they get the morning light without the worst of the afternoon heat." Chester looked toward the south slope, squinting into the distance. "Huh," he said, and it was the most sincere hush he had ever heard, the sound of a person genuinely revising their understanding of something. They fixed the fence together, because she was not about to stand and watch a man work on her property without doing her share of it. She held the posts while he drove them, and she strung the wire while he secured the staples, and she discovered over the course of 2 hours that Chester Atkins was a man who worked in comfortable silence when there was work to be done, and who talked easily and with intelligence when the conversation was about something real. He knew the land the way people who grow up on it know it, in his body, in his instincts, and she found herself telling him things about her farm that she had not told anyone, small observations about what worked and what didn't, the particular behavior of the north field in a dry year, the way the apple trees had changed the soil chemistry in the orchard. He listened. He actually listened, which was something she had not experienced in a conversation about farming before, because in Harlan's Crossing the assumption was that farming knowledge lived with the men and domestic knowledge lived with the women, and the two did not overlap much. Inez had grown up on a farm in Missouri and had opinions about soil and weather and livestock, and no particular interest in pretending she didn't. When the fence was done, she brought him water, and then, because it seemed rude not to, she brought him lunch. Cold biscuits and sliced ham and an apple from the orchard, because it was August and the apples were coming in. He sat on her porch steps and ate with the same focused appreciation he had given the pie, and she sat on the step above him because the porch chair squeaked badly and she kept meaning to fix it. And she told him that, and he looked at the chair and said he could fix that too if she had a screwdriver, and she laughed. "Mr. Atkins," she said, "are you planning to fix everything on this farm?" He looked at her with those rain-gray eyes, and this time the corner of his mouth definitely moved, unmistakably, into something that was unequivocally a smile, small and controlled but real. "Not all at once," he said. The thing about small towns in the Oklahoma Territory in 1882 was that everybody knew everything about everybody within approximately 48 hours, and the thing about widows was that people paid considerable attention to their movements. So by the following Monday, it was known in Harlan's Crossing that Chester Atkins had spent a Saturday morning fixing Inez Kendrick's east fence, and the knowing of it produced a variety of responses depending on who was doing the knowing. Mabel Dunmore thought it was lovely, and said so to her husband Frank, and to the 3 women who came in to shop on Monday morning. Reverend Haskins's wife thought it was premature and said so to Reverend Haskins, who did not think it was his business and said so back to her. The men at the Red Oak thought it was straightforward enough and talked about it for approximately 10 minutes before moving on to something they found more interesting. And Martha Prout, who had been Douglas Kendrick's second cousin and had never particularly liked Inez, thought it was suspicious and inappropriate, and let that be known as widely as possible. Inez heard about Martha Prout's comments third-hand through Mabel Dunmore, who told her with the particular energy of someone who wants to be helpful but cannot help being a little bit interested in the drama. Inez considered the comments for about a day and then set them aside, because she was 30 years old and a widow and a farmer, and she did not have the energy or the inclination to manage Martha Prout's opinions. If Chester Atkins chose to fix her fence and eat a biscuit on her porch, that was between the two of them and the fence. What she was less able to set aside was the realization that she had spent more of the previous week thinking about Chester Atkins than she had any reasonable grounds for. She thought about the way he had looked at her when he said the apology was not hers to make, the certainty in his voice, and the complete absence of cruelty in it. She thought about the way he had said he would be coming by that way Saturday, so practically, as if offering help was simply a logical step in a sequence of events. She thought about the way he ate the apple from her orchard, turning it in his hand first and looking at it like a person who appreciated the fact of something. She thought about this more than was sensible, and she knew she thought about it more than was sensible, and she told herself firmly that she was a woman with a farm to run and no time for such things. She went to church on Sunday, as she always did, and Chester Atkins was not there, as he apparently never was, which Reverend Haskins probably had opinions about. She helped with the church social on the following Wednesday and made 2 pies for it, peach and apple, and she noticed that the peach pie went first, and she thought about that too, which was ridiculous. It was the first week of September when she saw him again, and this time she was the one who appeared unexpectedly. She had been driving her wagon into town for feed when she came around the bend, and found Chester Atkins's wagon stopped on the side of the road, and Chester himself under the wagon doing something to the wheel axle. His horse was standing patiently nearby looking unconcerned, and Chester was on his back in the red dirt with his hat off and a wrench in his hand, and a particular expression on his face that she had come to recognize as his concentrating expression. She pulled her wagon over. "Axle pin," she said. He looked out from under the wagon with an expression of some surprise as if he had expected someone else, or no one. "Split linchpin," he said. "I've got another, but I haven't got enough room at this angle." "I can hold the axle," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You sure about that?" "I grew up on a farm in Missouri, Mr. Atkins," she said, already wrapping her reins and climbing down from her wagon. "I have held more axles than you have probably had occasion to." This was, she would concede, possibly an overstatement, but it was not entirely wrong. She crouched in the dust beside the wagon and put her hands where he directed, and between the two of them they had the pin replaced in less than 5 minutes, and then Chester slid out from under the wagon covered in red dust and stood and put his hat back on and looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "We're even," she said, "for the fence." Something moved in his eyes. He dusted his hands on his trousers. "I didn't do the fence to be owed anything." "I know," she said. "Neither did I." They looked at each other in the September sun, and the road was empty in both directions, and the sky above the territory was enormous and cloudless, and Inez was aware of something building between them, something she could feel along the back of her hands and at the base of her throat, slow and accumulating like a change in weather. "Are you going to the harvest social?" she asked, because she needed to say something. He appeared to consider this with the same gravity he gave to axle pins and fence posts. "Hadn't planned on it," he said. "You should," she said. "The whole town will be there. It's the 19th at the church grounds." "Will you be there?" he asked. "I'm on the organizing committee," she said. "I'll be there from 3 in the afternoon." Chester nodded slowly. "I might come by," he said. She nodded back, as if this were a perfectly ordinary exchange about community events and not at all what it clearly was, and climbed back onto her wagon and drove to town with the particular warm confusion of a woman who is beginning to understand that her heart is doing something her head has not fully approved yet. He came to the harvest social. He arrived at 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, after the games had started and the tables had filled up with covered dishes, and the fiddle player had begun tuning up behind the church. Inez saw him come through the gate, and she was in the middle of arranging apple butter jars on the swap table, and she made herself finish arranging the jars before she looked up properly. He had dressed for it. That was the first thing she noticed. He was wearing a clean dark shirt, and his good hat and his boots had been polished, and she felt something entirely tender toward him for that, the fact that he had dressed for the occasion. He moved through the crowd with the measured ease of a man who is comfortable enough in himself to be in a crowd, without needing to perform in it. He spoke to Orville Hayes at the blacksmith setup, and he nodded to Frank Dunmore, and he accepted a cup of cider from the church ladies' table without being awkward about it, and eventually his path and hers converged at the far end of the food tables, which Inez suspected was not entirely accidental for either of them. "You came," she said. "I said I might," he replied. She handed him a slice of apple cake from the table because it seemed the natural thing to do. He took it without comment and tried a bite, and his eyes went briefly to her face. "That's from your orchard," he said. She was startled. "How can you tell?" "Different flavor," he said. "More complex. Good soil does that." She stared at him. "You are a very particular person, Mr. Atkins." "I pay attention," he said, without apology. They walked the social grounds for an hour, and no one made a great deal of it outwardly, though she could see Mabel Dunmore watching them with warm and barely contained interest, and Martha Prout making a face from near the lemonade table that Inez made a deliberate point of not noticing. The fiddle player started in earnest, and some of the younger couples began dancing on the flat ground beside the church, the fast and cheerful kind of country dancing that required more enthusiasm than skill. "Do you dance?" Chester asked. "I do," she said. "Do you?" "After a fashion," he said. The fashion turned out to be genuine competence, restrained but real, the same quality he brought to fence posts and axle pins. He held her at the proper distance, his hand at her waist with a firmness that was respectful and entirely appropriate, and they moved through the steps together, and she was aware of every point of contact and every breath between them. He was a foot taller than her, and she had to look up to see his face, and when she did, she found him already looking at her, not with the self-conscious look of a person who has been caught staring, but with the open and quiet look of a person who sees something and is not going to pretend he doesn't. They danced twice, which was the number of dances that community decorum in Harlan's Crossing permitted before people started counting, and then they stepped aside and drank cider and watched the dancing, and talked about the harvest and the weather prospects for October, and a family named Bellows who had staked a claim up near the creek that everyone in town was watching because there were water rights questions about the claim. "Water rights," Inez said, and she heard the weight in her own voice. Chester looked at her. "It's a different situation," he said. "The Bellows family has a clean claim." "I know," she said. Every time I hear the words I think about what Douglas did." "Don't," he said. She looked at him. Don't carry it," he said. He was looking out at the dancers, and his voice was even and unhurried. "He made his choices. You're carrying something that was never yours to carry. Leave it down." She was quiet for a long moment. The fiddle music floated across the autumn evening air, and somewhere a child laughed, and the smell of wood smoke and apple cake and September dust was all around them. "That's easier said than done," she said. "Most true things are," Chester said. She looked at his profile, the clean line of his jaw in the evening light, and she thought about the fact that this man had every reason to be bitter about Douglas Kendrick and appeared to carry no bitterness at all. She thought about what that must require of a person, that kind of steady refusal to be eaten by what had been done to you. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Not resent it. What he did cost you enormously." Chester was quiet for a moment. A log popped in the nearby fire pit and sent a shower of sparks upward into the deepening blue sky. I resented it for a while, he said. For about a year. I was angry enough to spit nails. He paused. And then I decided the anger was costing me more than the cattle had. She looked at him steadily. And I started over, he said. Bought new stock, worked harder. The herd is coming back. The land doesn't care about what Douglas Kendrick did to me. The land just needs working. It was the most he had said at once since she'd met him, and she felt privileged by it in a way she did not entirely know how to express, so she didn't try to express it. She just said quietly, "You're a good man, Mr. Atkins." He looked at her with those rain-gray eyes in the firelight. "Chester," he said. She held his gaze. "Inez," she replied. Something settled between them at that, easy and important, like the click of a well-made lock. October came in dry and gold, and the relationship between Inez Kendrick and Chester Atkins developed with the quiet inevitability of a well-tended thing. He came by the farm on Saturday mornings now with some regularity, and there was always a reason, a gate that needed rehinging, a problem with the water pump, a question about the apple orchard, and the reason was always real and the work was always done. And then there was coffee on the porch and conversation that stretched longer each time, the two of them discovering the shape and texture of each other's minds with the pleasure of people who have not had this kind of conversation in a long time. Or perhaps ever. She found out that Chester had come from Kansas, that his father had been a failed farmer, and his mother a tenacious woman who had kept the family together by sheer force of will, until Chester was old enough to work a full man's share. She found out that he had been to Kansas City twice and didn't care for cities, that he had a particular affection for dogs and a tolerant lack of sentiment about horses, that he read when he could get books, which was less often than he would like, that he had been close once to marrying a woman in Kansas who had eventually married someone else, and that he carried no particular grief about it, only the philosophical observation that some things were not meant to be. She told him about Missouri and her parents, and the way the war had cast its shadow over everything in her childhood, the particular shape of growing up in a borderland state where loyalty split families and destroyed communities. She told him about what it had felt like to come west with Douglas and the high hope of it and the slow way it had eroded. She was careful with that, not unkind to Douglas's memory even now, because he had been her husband for 6 years, and the marriage had contained real things as well as the disappointments. Chester listened to all of it with the same attention he gave to everything, which was to say completely. He did not try to fix what she was telling him, did not offer solutions or reassurances that were not asked for. He just received it, and she felt received, which was a feeling she had not had in a very long time. One Saturday in late October he arrived with a dog. The dog was a large yellow hound of indeterminate breed with an expressive face and a wagging tail, and an apparent belief that every person it met had been waiting its whole life to encounter it. The hound launched itself toward Inez with such enthusiasm that she had to step back to avoid being knocked over, and Chester grabbed the dog's collar and said, "Biscuit," in a firm tone that the dog interpreted as general encouragement rather than correction. "Biscuit," Inez said, looking at the dog. "He showed up at my place 3 months ago," Chester said. "Just turned up out of the range one morning and decided to stay. I've been trying to leave him at home, but he jumps the fence." Biscuit looked up at Inez with enormous brown eyes and a tongue as long as a boot, and she immediately and completely lost her heart to the animal, crouching down to take his ears in both hands while he wriggled with joy. "He can stay," she said. Chester looked at the dog with a particular expression that she had come to understand was his fond expression, the one he tried to keep understated and mostly failed to. "Don't tell him that," he said. "He'll never go home." Biscuit came every Saturday after that, and the three of them developed a Saturday morning rhythm, Chester working on whatever the farm required, Biscuit supervising from various strategic positions, Inez working alongside Chester and making coffee and eventually lunch, and the conversation flowing between them like something natural and necessary. It was in November that Chester first touched her hand. They were at the kitchen table going over the records she had from the land registrar about the water rights that Douglas had manipulated. She had found a way, through a filing with the territorial office, to quietly restore the original claim to Chester without involving lawyers or creating a scandal, and she wanted to walk him through the papers before she filed them. And they were leaning over the documents side by side, and when she pointed to a particular line on the page, their hands touched. And neither of them moved away. The contact lasted longer than it needed to for a pointing gesture. His hand was warm and rough-palmed and still, and hers was smaller and equally still, and they both looked at the page with the particular focused attention of people who are aware of exactly one thing, and it is not the page. Then Chester turned his hand gently, slowly, and covered hers. Inez went very still. He did not say anything. He held her hand under his on the document and waited, giving her every opportunity to move away, and she did not move, and the kitchen was quiet around them, and the wind moved outside the window, and Biscuit, lying by the stove, sighed deeply in his sleep. "Inez," Chester said. "Yes," she said, because yes was the only possible answer, and she had known it for some time. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were very close, close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes in the gray November light, and the small scar at the edge of his jaw from something he had not told her about yet but would, and the slight unsteadiness in him that she recognized as the same thing she was feeling herself, the strange vulnerability of beginning. He touched her face with his other hand, just his fingertips at her cheek, the gentlest possible gesture, asking without words, and she answered without words by not moving away, and he kissed her. It was a quiet kiss, unhurried and certain, the kind of kiss that comes from people who have been patient and who understand what they are doing. Not impulsive, not reckless, chosen, deliberate. She felt it all the way down and kept her eyes closed for a moment after, and when she opened them, Chester was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, an openness, something carefully held finally let go. "I should have mentioned," he said quietly, "that I've been thinking about doing that since about the second Saturday." She laughed, a real laugh that surprised both of them with its warmth. "The second Saturday," she said. "What stopped you the first?" "You had paint on your hands," he said. "That's your reason." "I thought it would distract me," he said. She laughed again and shook her head and looked down at their joined hands on the documents, and then the warmth of it settled into something more serious, and she looked back up at him. "Chester," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's not long since you lost him. I know that's complicated. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not a woman who is led somewhere she doesn't want to go," she said. "I'm here because I want to be here." He held her gaze and nodded once, and the nod contained everything. She filed the land office papers the following week, and the water rights were quietly restored to Chester Atkins's claim. There was no announcement. There was no acknowledgement from the land office, only a correction in the records, which was all she had wanted. She told Chester when it was done, sitting on his porch with coffee in the late November cold, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "You didn't have to do that either," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it was the right thing to do, and I had the means to do it. That's enough reason." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand without ceremony, just folded her fingers into his palm, and they sat in the cold air on his porch and drank their coffee and watched the winter coming in across the flat open land. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a cold one in the Oklahoma Territory, the kind of cold that tested the adequacy of your preparations and the quality of your firewood and the resilience of your livestock. Inez had put her farm up well before the first frost, had her root cellar full and her wood stacked deep, and her apple crop processed into sauce and dried slices, and a dozen quarts of cider vinegar that she was pleased with. She was not a woman who wintered badly. Chester rode to her farm 3 times a week during December, and they were past the point of pretending there was always a repair reason for the visit, though there was often a reason anyway because a farm in winter always has something that needs attention. He helped her haul wood and check her livestock and reinforce the barn door that had been warping in the wet cold, and she sent him home with soup or pie or once, memorably, a jar of the apple cider vinegar that he looked at with complete gravity and said he would keep it for a very long time. The community noticed. The community always notices. That is the nature of small communities, and in Harlan's Crossing the noticing of Chester Atkins and Inez Kendrick was generally warm. Mabel Dunmore said openly that she thought it was the nicest thing to happen in Harlan's Crossing in 2 years. Orville Hayes made a quiet comment to Chester at the feedlot that Chester received with a nod and no further discussion. Even Reverend Haskins made a point of greeting Chester warmly at the door of the church on the Sunday in December when Chester came to service for the first time, which Inez noticed had required some internal decision-making on Chester's part given that he had not attended church in some while. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said quietly as they took their seats. "I know," he said. Martha Prout continued to disapprove, loudly, at the lemonade table and at the sewing circle and at the post office, and Inez continued to not care about Martha Prout's disapproval, which she felt was the most efficient approach to the situation. Christmas came, and with it the tradition in Harlan's Crossing of a Christmas Eve gathering at the church, a modest and warm affair with carols, and a reading from Reverend Haskins and cider and cookies, and the specific relief of a community that has gotten its people through another hard year. Inez wore the blue cotton dress she had made from the bolt she had bought in August, and Chester arrived at her farm at 4 in the afternoon to walk with her to the church, which was both unnecessary and entirely something she had hoped he would do. He knocked on her door with his hat in his hands and a small wrapped parcel under his arm, and she opened the door in the blue dress, and he looked at her for a moment without saying anything with the particular look that she had come to treasure, the one where he was simply taking in the fact of her. "You look very fine," he said. "Thank you," she said. "What is that?" He handed her the parcel. She opened it at the kitchen table while he stood nearby. Inside was a book, a recent edition of a collection of essays about the natural history of the prairie, the kind of book she would never have thought to buy herself, but that was absolutely exactly what she would want, and she looked up at him with the book in her hands and felt something enormous and simple. "Chester," she said. "There's a whole chapter on orchard cultivation in semi-arid climates," he said, in the tone of a man who has been thinking about this gift for some time and is now delivering information about it with restrained enthusiasm. "I thought it might be useful for the apple trees." "It's wonderful," she said. She had a gift for him too, a pair of good leather gloves she had ordered through the mail, heavy-lined for winter work, because she had noticed his old pair was nearly through at the palms. She gave them to him and watched his face as he turned them over in his hands, the same way he turned an apple, and she thought that she loved the way he paid attention to things. She thought that she loved him. That was when she knew it, standing in her kitchen in her blue dress on Christmas Eve with the natural history book in her hand, and Chester Atkins holding his new gloves with a look on his face that said he understood exactly what they meant. She loved him. The recognition of it was not frightening exactly, though it was large. It was more like stepping out of a house and into open air and finding the air clean. She had loved Douglas once in a smaller and more anxious way, and the time since his death had been a solitude that was partly grief and partly, she could admit now, relief. This feeling was different from either. This was the feeling of choosing freely, with full knowledge of the cost things can carry and choosing still. She did not say it that evening. It was too new and too important to rush. But she carried it with her through the Christmas Eve service, through the carols and the cider and the warm, crowded familiarity of her community, with Chester standing beside her with his hand occasionally at the small of her back, present and steady, and she carried it home again like something precious. January came, and with it the anniversary of Douglas's death, which Inez marked quietly and without ceremony, spending a morning with her thoughts and her coffee, and the complicated truth that a person can grieve a marriage more than a man, and that both feelings are legitimate. She did not tell Chester about the anniversary, but he appeared at her farm that afternoon with biscuit and a pot of soup he had made himself, which she knew from the flavor was not from any recipe known to civilization, but was warm and substantial, and she did not ask him how he had known what day it was. She suspected Mabel Dunmore. In February, on a Sunday after church, Chester asked her to walk with him. They walked north of town on the road toward his property, the February sky white and cold above the bare cottonwoods along the creek. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Chester stopped and turned to face her on the road, and he was not wearing his usual expression of contained calm. He looked like a man working up to something, and the working up was visible, which was unusual for him, and which she found immensely endearing. "Inez," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something to you, and I want to say it right, so I've been thinking about how to say it for about a month." She looked up at him and kept her face still, but her heart was doing something loud. "I'm not a man with a great deal to offer in the way of money or circumstances," he said. "The cattle operation is coming along, but it's not large. The house needs work. I know that." He paused. "What I can offer is this: I am a man who is going to show up every day, and I am going to pay attention to what matters to you, and I am going to work beside you and not in front of you, and I am not going to do anything behind your back that I wouldn't do to your face." He stopped. His jaw was tight in the way she had come to recognize as him holding himself very still when something mattered very much. "I'm asking you to marry me, Inez. I'm asking it plain because that's the only way I know how to ask." She looked at this man standing on a February road in the Oklahoma Territory, with the white sky behind him, and the creek-bottom cottonwoods standing bare, and the sound of a distant crow carrying in the cold air. And she thought about the day she had knocked on his door with a pie, and an apology that he had refused to accept. And she thought about the fence posts and the axle pin and the harvest social and Christmas Eve, and the pot of soup he had made without a recipe, and the way he had covered her hand with his on a land document and waited. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and in one stride he closed the space between them and took her face in both his gloved hands, the good leather gloves she had given him for Christmas, and kissed her in the middle of the February road with the cold wind moving through the cottonwoods. And she kissed him back with everything she had, her hands in the front of his coat, and they stayed there on that empty road for a long, warm minute, unbothered by weather or propriety or the past. When they pulled apart, Chester's eyes were bright, which was the most undone she had ever seen him look, and she thought she would remember this moment for the rest of her life with the particular sharpness of things that are truly earned. They married in April. The wedding was at the Harlan's Crossing Church on a Saturday afternoon, which was the first genuinely warm day of spring, the kind of April day the territory produced occasionally like a gift, all soft sky and green pushing up through the red dirt, and the smell of the earth waking. Reverend Haskins performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Mabel and Frank Dunmore sat in the front row, Mabel weeping happily into her handkerchief starting from approximately the moment the vows began. Orville Hayes was there in his Sunday best. The entire community of Harlan's Crossing who could get to the church was there, because whatever the community might have said about the speed or the propriety, when it came to the actual wedding, almost everyone was in favor of it. Even Martha Prout came, though she sat in the back and had the particular expression of a person who is determined to be unmoved by something that is clearly moving. Inez wore a dress of deep ivory cotton with a lace collar that had been her mother's, let out and altered to fit her, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that she had picked herself that morning from the creek bank, because she could not see the point in buying flowers when the land was already offering them. She walked to the front of the church alone because she was a woman who walked her own path, and she watched Chester's face as she came down the aisle, and the expression on his face was the one she would return to in her memory for years, the whole of it, the steadiness and the warmth and the slight undone quality that he could not quite contain, and she thought, "This is the right thing." Chester's vows were simple and direct like the man himself. He said, "I will be here. I will work beside you. I will tell you the truth. I will not take from what is yours without your knowledge. I choose you every day for as long as I have." Hers were equally plain, "I choose you. I give you my trust, which I do not give easily. I give you my farm and my apple orchard and my recipes and my opinions, of which there are many. I will be honest with you, and I expect the same. I choose you." Reverend Haskins pronounced them married with undisguised satisfaction, and Chester kissed her in front of the entire town, and Mabel Dunmore burst into a fresh wave of tears, and Biscuit, who had been tied to the porch post outside, began to howl with what everyone agreed was the spirit of celebration. The reception was held in the churchyard, with long tables covered in the food of the community. Every family had brought something, and the fiddle player from the harvest social and his brother on guitar, and the dancing that followed was the best that Harlan's Crossing had seen in years. Everyone with some reason to celebrate, everyone willing to kick up their heels on a warm April afternoon. Chester danced with Inez for the first song and the last, and in between he talked with Orville Hayes about cattle and with Frank Dunmore about the spring planting, and with a young man named Eli Beaumont, who had recently staked a claim north of Chester's and was looking uncertain about what he had gotten himself into. Chester talked to the young man with the same steady patience he brought to everything else, the voice of a man who had started from scratch himself and knew what that felt like. And Inez watched this from across the churchyard and felt proud of him in a way that was clean and uncomplicated. Mabel Dunmore appeared at Inez's elbow at some point in the afternoon with a cup of lemonade and a look of pure satisfaction. "I knew the moment I saw him come into the store that August," Mabel said. "I knew right then something would come of it." Inez looked at her. "The August he came in for hinges. The August you were buying your blue cotton and he was watching the door," Mabel said, with the serene confidence of a woman who pays attention to everything. Inez did not know what to do with that, so she drank her lemonade and smiled. They decided that Inez's farm, with its established orchard and good soil, would remain operational, and that Chester would divide his time between the farm and his cattle operation, which was only 4 miles north. It was a practical arrangement, and also, Inez thought, the kind of arrangement that could only work between people who genuinely respected each other's work, which they did. The first spring and summer of their marriage was full of good things. Chester brought cattle through Inez's property twice in the spring when the east pasture was open, and she watched from her porch as he and the young cowhand he had hired, a serious boy of about 19 named Cal Reeves, moved the herd in the warm morning, and she thought about how much she liked looking at this life she had made. Cal Reeves turned out to be something of a fixture around both the farm and the cattle operation, a boy from Arkansas who had come west with nothing and was working with the focused determination of someone building something from scratch. He was good with animals, quick learning, and possessed of a natural dignity that Chester respected, and that made Inez like him. They fed him dinner on Saturdays, and he ate with the careful gratitude of a young man who is not always sure he is welcome and is working to prove himself. And Inez made a point of making sure he knew he was welcome, because she remembered what it was to be young and uncertain in a new land. The apple orchard produced particularly well that first summer, the trees laden with fruit in a way that felt almost celebratory, and Inez spent 3 weeks in late August and early September processing apples with the particular cheerful industry of a person whose orchard is performing. Chester helped on the weekends, learning the process with his usual focused attention. And by the end of it, he had an opinion about the ideal ratio of sugar to cider in applesauce that was, Inez conceded, not entirely wrong. Chester brought her a dog of her own in September, not a puppy, because Chester was a practical man but an adult female hound, calm and capable, who appeared at the farm in the back of his wagon one Saturday and stepped out with the composed dignity of an animal who knows exactly what she is worth. She was dark brown with a white chest, and she went immediately to Biscuit, and they touched noses, and the matter was settled. "Where did you find her?" Inez asked. "Hayes's cousin's place outside of town," Chester said. "They had too many dogs. Does she have a name? They called her Copper, but she doesn't seem attached to it." Inez looked at the dog for a moment. The dog looked back at her with dark, composed eyes. "Molly," Inez said, and the dog's ear moved. "Molly it is," Chester agreed. That fall, Inez discovered she was expecting. She told Chester on a Sunday morning in October, sitting at the kitchen table of their farm with coffee cups between them and the Sunday light coming in through the clean glass, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that she found entirely delightful: surprise, then a flooding warmth, then the contained but unmistakable joy of a man who has been handed something enormous. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Inez," he said. "I know," she said. "It's a great deal to take in." "It's wonderful," he said, and his voice was low and absolutely certain. "It's wonderful." She looked at him across the table, this man with his rain-gray eyes and his steady hands and his particular way of saying things plainly and meaning every word, and she felt the rightness of it moving through her like something geological, deep and foundational. "You're happy," she said. "I'm very happy," he said. "Are you?" She thought about the year behind her, the August afternoon with the pie and the apology he had refused, the fence posts and the harvest social, the November documents and the hand covering hers, the February road with the white sky and the cottonwoods, the April wedding and the long and fruitful summer, and now this kitchen in October with coffee and morning light and the knowledge of a new life beginning. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said, and it was entirely true. The winter of their first married year was different from the one before it, not because it was warmer. It was, if anything, colder, but because the house was no longer a solitary place. There was a second pair of boots at the door and a second coffee cup habitually on the counter, and the particular warm texture of two lives genuinely braided together. Chester worked through the winter with the same steady energy as always, managing his cattle and the farm repairs with Cal Reeves's help, and Inez continued to run the farm's domestic and production side, and to read her natural history book with the dog and the hound at her feet in the evenings. And sometimes she would read passages aloud to Chester, and they would discuss them with the easy pleasure of two people who liked the same kinds of questions about the world. Mabel Dunmore organized a baby shower in February that brought nearly every woman in Harlan's Crossing to the church hall, and Inez received blankets and small garments with genuine gratitude, touched by the community's warmth. Martha Prout did not attend, which everyone noted and no one mentioned, and Inez thought it was probably easier for everyone that way. The baby came in April, 1 year and 3 weeks after the wedding. It was a boy. Chester was present for it, which was not common in 1883, most men keeping to other parts of the house while the women managed the birth. But Chester Atkins was not most men, and Inez had made clear that she wanted him there. And so he was. He held her hand through the worst of it with the same steady quality he brought to everything, and when the child arrived and began his loud opinions about the world, Chester looked at the baby in Inez's arms with an expression that undid her completely, all the calm and the containment of him simply gone, replaced with something open and enormous. "A boy," Mabel Dunmore said, because Mabel had come to help as she had come to help women in the town for 20 years. "A strong, healthy boy." Chester was not capable of speech for approximately 2 minutes. When he found words again, they were, "He's perfect." "He looks like you," Inez said, looking at the dark-haired child. "He looks like himself," Chester said, and carefully put one finger into the baby's tiny fist, which gripped it with the absolute certainty of the newly arrived. And Chester made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, and Inez thought she would carry that sound in her chest for the rest of her life. They named him James after Chester's father, with the middle name Thomas after Inez's father, and the combination pleased them both. James Atkins announced himself to the world with considerable volume, and maintained this policy consistently. He was a vigorous, healthy baby who slept in the wooden cradle Chester had made in the winter nights with a focus and precision that Inez had recognized as his particular expression of love, sanding every surface by lamplight until it was smooth enough for a child's soft skin. The summer of 1883 was full with two cattle operations partly merged, a farm at full production, a new baby, and all the daily logistics of a life being built in good faith. Cal Reeves took on more responsibility with the cattle and proved himself steady and worth trusting, and Chester gave him a raise in pay and the use of the small bunkhouse on the north pasture, and Inez made sure there was always a meal in it for him when he worked through the weekend. Eli Beaumont, the young man Chester had talked to at the wedding reception, came around sometimes with questions about his claim, and Chester answered them with patient generosity. And Inez noticed that Eli increasingly found reasons to help with things at the farm, and she also noticed that he had begun to linger near the general store on Tuesday mornings when Mabel Dunmore's niece, Clara, came in to do the store accounts. Inez did not comment on this to anyone except Chester, and Chester said, in the tone of a man who has noticed it too and considers it a reasonable development. Clara and Eli Beaumont were married the following spring, which made Harlan's crossing 2 weddings in 2 years, and at their reception Chester danced with Inez and she was carrying their second child, though only she and Chester knew it yet, and they kept that knowledge between them like something warm during the dancing and the cider and the fiddle music under the late April sky. The second child came in November, and this time it was a girl. She arrived in the night with less drama than James had and more efficiency, as if she had someplace to be, and she had Inez's dark eyes and Chester's quiet self-possession from the very beginning, regarding the world with a composed interest that made Chester laugh the way he rarely laughed, fully and with his whole face. "She's looking at everything," he said, leaning over the cradle. "She's deciding what she thinks of it," Inez said. They named her Eileen or me, after Inez's mother, and the month she almost came in before changing her mind. She and James were immediately and thoroughly interested in each other, James approaching his sister with the proprietary affection of a toddler who has been told repeatedly that this is something wonderful and mostly believes it. Harlan's Crossing grew in the years that followed, as the territory grew more families, more claims, more buildings on the main street, a new schoolhouse that was larger than the old one, and that both James Atkins and Eileen Atkins would eventually attend with the characteristic Atkins qualities of attentiveness and directness that their teachers found alternately delightful and challenging. The town got a telegraph line in 1885, which changed everything and nothing about the fundamental nature of life on the land. Chester's cattle operation continued to grow, slowly and solidly, the way he approached everything, never overextended, always sustainable. The herd that Inez Kendrick had helped destroy was rebuilt and then surpassed, and by 1886 Chester Atkins was among the established cattlemen of the territory, not wealthy by any city standard but secure, landed, building. The apple orchard, read about in that Christmas book and tended with accumulated knowledge and attention, became something remarkable. Inez began selling apple products, sauce, dried apple, cider, vinegar, and eventually a preserved apple butter that Mabel Dunmore began stocking at the general store, and the income from the orchard, modest but consistent, became a meaningful part of the household economy, and also, Inez recognized, a source of profound satisfaction that was entirely her own. She had taken a thing that Douglas had planted and made it into something better than he had intended, which seemed right. On an October evening in 1886, 4 years after a woman with a pie knocked on a man's door and changed both their lives, Inez and Chester sat on their porch in the cooling evening air. James was inside working on his letters by lamplight, a serious 7-year-old who approached the alphabet with the same focused gravity his father brought to fence posts. Eleanor was asleep in her room, having decided firmly at 7 o'clock that the day was over, a decision she communicated with the same composed directness she had brought to every day since her birth. Biscuit lay on the porch boards near Chester's feet, aging now and slower, but still entirely convinced that the world had been created for his benefit. Molly lay inside near the kitchen stove, warming her old bones with the dignified comfort of a dog who has spent her years well. The territory spread out before them in the October evening, the land going flat and enormous under a sky that was turning from amber to deep blue, the first stars coming out over the western horizon, and somewhere a pair of coyotes called to each other across the darkening distance. Chester had his arm around Inez on the porch, her head on his shoulder, and they had been sitting in comfortable silence for a quarter of an hour, the kind of silence that contains everything and needs nothing added. "I was thinking today," Inez said. "What about?" "About the first time I came here," she said, "to your door, with the pie." Chester's arm tightened slightly around her shoulder. "I almost didn't knock," she said. "I know." She looked up at him. "How do you know?" "Because you stood on that porch for almost 2 minutes before you knocked," he said. "I heard your boots on the steps and then nothing, and I waited to see if you'd go." She stared at him. "You heard me standing there. Why didn't you open the door?" "Because if you were going to knock, you needed to do it yourself," he said. "And if you weren't ready to knock, opening the door at you wasn't going to help anything." She held his gaze for a moment and then shook her head slowly, half exasperated and half something that was much warmer than exasperation. "You are the most particular person I have ever known." "You've mentioned," he said. "It's a quality," she said. "A very specific quality." He looked down at her with those gray-blue eyes in the October evening, and she could see in them the same thing she had seen on the February road when she said yes, the same thing on their wedding morning, the same thing across the kitchen table when she told him about James coming, the steady and unflinching and full presence of him, this man who paid attention to things and meant what he said and showed up. "Chester," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. "I have been meaning to say it more plainly and more often, and I am saying it now. I love you. I love this life." He was quiet for a moment, and the October sky deepened above them, and the coyotes called again in the distance, and Biscuit made a small sound of unconcerned comfort at their feet. "I love you, Inez," Chester said. "I've loved you since approximately the second Saturday." She laughed, and it was the warm and genuine laugh that he had always liked best, the one that came out of her in spite of herself. And she turned her face into his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him around her and the particular quality of the October evening air, clean and cold, and full of the smell of the land. The porch light was warm, and the house behind them was full of sleeping children and old dogs and the smell of apple butter and wood smoke. And Chester Atkins held his wife in the growing dark and thought about the day she had knocked on his door with a pie, and an apology he had not accepted because the wrong was not hers, and how he had taken the pie and let her in because the pie was extraordinary, and because something about the woman who had made it had been extraordinary too, and how the whole of the life they had built since then had been built the same way it had begun, in plainness and honesty and work, and in the daily choice to show up for each other, which was, he had come to believe, the full sum of what love required. The stars came out over the territory one by one, and the two of them sat on their porch in the growing dark, and they were home. In the years that followed, the life they had built deepened and settled like good timber, gaining character and strength with time. James grew into a boy who was both his father's son and very much his own person, thoughtful and quiet, with his mother's sharp eyes and her way of asking questions that got to the center of a thing faster than most people were comfortable with. Alina grew into a child of such composed self-possession that even at 5 years old she seemed to know exactly what she was worth. And the knowledge was not arrogance but simply certainty, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is simply there. Cal Reeves, who had grown from an uncertain boy to a reliable young man under Chester's steady guidance, eventually bought his own claim east of town in 1887, and Chester rode with him to the land office to file the papers and stood beside him the way a man stands beside a son, or something close to it. Cal worked his claim with the same careful diligence he had learned on Chester's operation, and he came back on weekends sometimes, for dinner and conversation, and a piece of whatever Inez had baked, and the Atkins table was always set with enough. The general store got a new front porch in 1887, and the Red Oak got a new proprietor who was marginally less interested in the ambiguities of territorial law, and Harlan's Crossing got its first proper doctor in 1888, a young man from St. Louis named Dr. Fletcher, who was alarmed by the casualness with which the territory handled medical matters and went about addressing it with the energy of the recently trained. Martha Prout eventually mellowed, not dramatically but measurably. She came to Inez's Christmas gathering in 1887 and ate 2 pieces of apple cake, and offered the opinion that the orchard was impressive for this climate, which from Martha Prout was something close to a peace offering, and Inez accepted it as such and gave her a jar of apple butter to take home, and that was the end of the particular coolness between them. The water rights situation with the land registrar came to a proper legal resolution in 1886, when the territorial court reviewed several suspicious filings from the early years of the territory's opening, and the original corrections Inez had made were formally confirmed in the record. Chester did not speak of this at length, but he and Inez both understood that the settling of it, cleanly and in the record, closed the last door of the wrong Douglas Kendrick had done. Douglas Kendrick himself was not a monster in Inez's memory. He was a man who had made choices she could not excuse, and who had also been, in smaller and earlier ways, the person she had married. She kept a small photograph of him, one from their early years in Missouri when the High Hope was still intact, in the bottom of her cedar chest, not as a mourning thing, but as an honest accounting of where her life had come from. Chester knew it was there and had no objection to its presence, because Chester Atkins was a man who understood that history is not the enemy of the present, and that a person's full life is worth keeping honestly. In the spring of 1889, when the Oklahoma Territory land run brought thousands of new settlers rushing to stake claims, and the territory itself trembled with the particular chaotic energy of a world being remade, the Atkins farm and cattle operation were already established enough to observe the rush with the calm of people who had built their foundation before the wave came. Chester watched the new settlers arrive with the attentive generosity he had always brought to the young and uncertain, and more than a few families found their way to his porch in those first weeks, needing advice about which land was good and which was not, and what to plant first, and how to manage water in a dry year. Inez fed them because that was what she did, and Chester talked to them plainly because that was what he did, and the couple that they had become was visible in those days in the particular quality of the help they gave, practical, honest, complete, and without any expectation of return. James Atkins, at 10 years old, began helping Chester with the lighter work of the cattle operation that summer, and Chester worked with him with the same patient attention he brought to everything, and Inez watched her son absorbing his father's way of being in the world, the steadiness, the plain speech, the refusal to take shortcuts that someone else would pay for, and she felt something she could only describe as profound satisfaction, the deep and quiet kind that comes from seeing something good pass forward. Alina, at 6, was more interested in the orchard than the cattle, which surprised no one who knew her, and she spent her Saturdays trailing Inez through the apple trees with a small notebook she had asked for specifically, writing down what she observed with the careful seriousness of a scientist, which Inez encouraged entirely. "She's going to be extraordinary," Chester said one evening, watching Alina at the kitchen table reading her own notes back with a small frown of concentration. "She already is," Inez said. Chester turned and looked at his wife with that steady gaze she had come to know as thoroughly as the lines of her own land, and she looked back at him. And between them in the quiet kitchen the life they had built was present in every ordinary detail, the worn table and the good light and the children and the sound of Biscuit, ancient now and mostly sleeping, breathing slow and steady by the stove. "I want you to know something," Chester said. She waited. "That day you knocked on my door," he said, "with the pie. I went back inside after you left and I sat down in this chair right here and I thought, that woman is going to change something." Inez looked at him. "You thought that after one visit?" "I thought it before you knocked," he said. "I was watching through the window when you were standing on the porch and I could see you working up the courage and I thought, whoever she is, she's here to do something that costs her something, and that's not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. "And then you opened the door," she said. "And then you were standing there with a peach pie and the most careful and honest face I had ever seen on a person," he said, "and I knew." She reached across the table and took his hand, the calloused and certain hand she had held on so many mornings and evenings and in between times over 7 years, the hand that had covered hers on a land document and held her through a birth and held their babies and built a cradle by lamplight. And she held it now in the kitchen of their farm with the October dark coming in through the window and the children nearby and the dogs breathing slow. "I love you, Chester Atkins," she said. "I love you, Inez Atkins," he said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, simple and certain, and she closed her eyes for a moment and felt the full weight of everything she had, and was grateful for every piece of it, even the hard pieces, even Douglas and the water rights and the cold winters and the difficult soil, because all of it had led here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this life that was hers completely and truly and forever. James appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, peering at them with the particular look of a child who has come to report something important and found his parents being impractically affectionate, and the expression on his face was so precisely his father's expression, the raised eyebrow, the contained amusement that both Inez and Chester laughed. "What is it, James?" Inez said. "Alina is reading by candlelight past her bedtime," James reported, with the righteous efficiency of a 10-year-old who takes the rules seriously. "Thank you," Chester said. "Tell her the candle goes out in 5 minutes." James went away satisfied, and Chester and Inez looked at each other across the kitchen table with the shared warmth of people who find the daily comedy of family life genuinely delightful. And outside the window the October sky was full of stars over the territory, enormous and clear and permanent, and the house was warm, and everything was as it should be. The pie tin from that August afternoon in 1882 still lived on a shelf in Inez Atkins's kitchen, though it had been used many times since for other pies, peach and apple and rhubarb, and whatever the season and the orchard offered. She kept it on that particular shelf because she knew what it had carried the first time, and she found a quiet satisfaction in the fact that something which had begun as an insufficient apology had become instead the beginning of everything she most valued. Chester sometimes caught her looking at it with that small particular smile she had, not the broad laugh that was his favorite sound, but the quieter smile that she gave to things that pleased her deeply and privately. And he always felt, when he saw that smile, the same thing he had felt standing in his doorway on an August afternoon with a woman in a dusty dress holding a pie out to him. That something had arrived, unexpected and complete, and that the only right thing to do was to let it in. He had taken the pie, he had been right to. Some things were simply as simple as that and also as profound, and Chester Atkins had lived long enough in the territory to know that the land teaches you this eventually, that what matters is what you build, and that you build it one honest day at a time, and that a good woman and a good farm and a good life under a wide sky is wealth enough for any man, and more than most deserve. He was grateful. Every single day he was grateful. And Inez, in the kitchen with the flour on her hands and the apple orchard visible through the window, and the sounds of her children and her husband and her dogs filling the house with their particular beloved noise, was grateful too, with the full and steady gratitude of a woman who had knocked on a door with a pie and an apology, and received instead, from the hands of a man plain, and honest enough to refuse the apology and accept the pie, the whole rest of her life.